Okay, I want to explain what we're going to be doing next. It's something I think you can definitely do. Hopefully something you'll enjoy and something that will benefit you. In this next phase of the class, we're going to be doing a kind of mini project that has to do with some writing, and it's going to incorporate a lot of the different types of sources and conversations that we've been having in this particular time period. So this first handout I'm going to use right now to kind of explain to you generally what's going on, and we're going to begin this project today. It really is a 2-week project. I'm not going to give you anything and say, okay, your paper's due tomorrow. I'm not doing that. What we're doing is breaking it down so that you can think about this as writing as a process, so you can think about what arguments you're going to make. You can figure out the different types of sources you have to choose from, including films, and hopefully come up with a very strong project, which should definitely be possible. Again, using this handout, I'm going to go through some of the general instructions now, and you'll start to see how things unfold over the next couple of class periods. We're doing a project on the American Revolution. The last couple of classes, we talked about sort of the early colonies. We talked about the 18th century and kind of the development and change in African-American communities that are growing in that period. Now we get to what is one of the main tipping points or kind of critical moments in all of American history and all of world history, in a sense. Some people call this the Age of Revolution because within about 20 years, there are 3 major revolutions, at least in the world. The American Revolution, the revolution in France shortly thereafter, and the revolution in Haiti, which is going to create first the American Revolution, creates the first independent republic in the Western Hemisphere. France obviously is going to extend many of these ideas, pattern much of its revolution on the United States, even some of the same rhetoric in some ways. And just as importantly, and maybe even more importantly for our purposes, the Haitian Revolution, which is going to create the second independent republic in the Western Hemisphere and the first black independent republic. Shortly, a short distance off the coast of the United States, you have a black nation that's created, formerly a slave colony. They decide that revolution stuff sounds good. Right? They decide that all men are created equal rhetoric sounds good. We want it too. And they're willing to fight and die for it, and they do exactly that. They're going to defeat the French. They're going to defeat a number of European nations that come and try to reconquer them. So this Age of Revolution is particularly important, really beginning with the American Revolution. In terms of African American history, the American Revolution is really a contradiction. Right? We've already touched on some of these ideas in terms of thinking about people like a Thomas Jefferson. Right, people thinking of Thomas Jefferson sitting down writing the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, right? Then leaning over and asking his slave for a drink of lemonade. That seems like a contradiction. How can you write these words and believe these words and yet you hold people as slaves? Right, so obviously for African Americans, there's going to be some complications around this idea of the revolution itself. I also told you at the very beginning of this class that African American history can be harder in some ways because it's more complicated. We learn American history. We have to, right? We learn about African civilizations, African backgrounds as well, right? So in some ways, I think it might even be harder than American history, right? It's really, especially in this early period, it's really a kind of global history, and it's a whole Atlantic world history. We're talking about the Caribbean and South America and the African continent and the United States. In this moment, we have to think about how the United States itself is going to, in some ways, change and in some ways not change. But more specifically, we want to read this revolution through the eyes of African Americans. What are African Americans seeing throughout this age of revolution? And so this project really is based on that. It's a question of perspective. Right? The American Revolution looks very different through Thomas Jefferson's eyes than it looked through his slave's eyes. Even though one of his slaves was a male slave that he grew up with of his same age. Right? Both male, both the same age, but they're going to see the revolution differently, you could imagine. Right? So I want you to be thinking about this issue of perspective, these various contradictions around the rhetoric of the American Revolution and how African Americans are going to react and respond to it. Keep those big things in mind as we lay out this project, right? So in terms of this handout, it says Slavery and Freedom in Revolutionary America, and there's a series of questions really that guide this project. I like to ask you questions because your answers to those questions might be different. There might be some room for interpretation here, but in many ways your answer to these major questions becomes your argument, becomes your thesis statement. So be thinking about your answers to these questions as we kind of lay these things out. So Slavery and Freedom in Revolutionary America. Was the American Revolution conservative from the perspective of African Americans, and were blacks its contradiction? There's a whole argument within American history. People that write about the revolution have debated whether or not it was truly a radical or a conservative revolution. Generally, we think of revolutions as being radical, right? People overthrowing their government, getting rid of folks that were in charge and putting someone else in charge. That's a pretty radical move, right? Whereas being conservative or conserving the system the way that it was, right? Supporting the status quo, keeping things as they are. Revolution would seem to go against that. But a lot of historians have argued that maybe some revolutions are not as radical as we might think. Right? Maybe some of these revolutions conserve more than they actually change. So, for example, a lot of folks talk about the American Revolution and the Founding Fathers say, did they change that much? Right? Maybe they didn't go far enough. Maybe we can specifically make that case if we think about this from the perspective of African Americans. I'd always keep the perspective of African Americans in mind as we're laying out this project, as we're thinking about your answer to that first question: is it radical or conservative in your view? Is it more radical than conservative in your view? And were African Americans its main contradiction? So this first part is kind of an overview, and I want to give you some statistics, give you some background. We'll get a lot more background and things that are going to help you develop your argument, help you focus what you might specifically talk about in this paper, but this kind of begins that process. Introduction. By 1770, 1/5 of the population of the 13 colonies was of African ancestry. So by 1770, a few years before really revolution is really going to kick off, right? 6 years before the Declaration of Independence, kind of the midpoint of the revolution in some ways. 20% of the population were of African ancestry. That's a big number. And almost 95% of the African descendants were slaves. Beginning with the Boston Massacre in 1770 and lasting for the duration of the war, African Americans played a major role in the American struggle for independence. Now that in and of itself may be surprising, right? In most histories of the American Revolution in U.S. history classes, you don't get that much talk about black people. You just don't. You talk about the Founding Fathers, you talk about Betsy Ross and these sorts of ideas, but you don't find out some of these things that we'll be looking at a little more closely. We want to pay attention to their major role in the revolution and their complicated role in the revolution. As such a large percentage of the American population, both slaves and free blacks, were vital to both the American and the British causes. Remember, these Americans, as they're coming to call themselves, are fighting against the British for their freedom. The British are fighting to maintain control of what they see as their colonies. So there are two sides from the beginning. African Americans, or African descendants, we could say, are going to play a role on both sides of that conflict. They're going to play a role on both sides. In addition to civilians, black soldiers and sailors, such as Austin Dabney, Joseph Ranger, Caesar Tarrant, and Oliver Cromwell, proved themselves to be true patriots through their sacrifices in defense of their American homeland. Remember where we started this class, right? Laying out ideas of imagined community and patriotism and all that, loyalty to your nation. These guys are going to demonstrate that by supporting what becomes the United States. They say, look, we're going to fight for what we think our country is and defend it against attack as they saw it from the British. Right? They're demonstrating their patriotism. Well, some African Americans are going to say, well, wait a second. What is it we're defending? Especially if you are a slave. You might think, somebody's trying to kill my slave master? Maybe I should help them. Right? Maybe their imagined community is going to help the British. There are going to be some difficult choices that have to be made for African Americans living through this period. They have to first define what is their nation? What is their interest? What are they loyal to? What are they patriotic to? So these guys, soldiers and sailors in particular on this side, will fight for their American homeland. Other blacks, such as Boston King, fought just as bravely on the British side. There are going to be some African-descended peoples that say, I'm going to fight with the British. What's the famous phrase? If your enemy's enemy is your friend. They're like, look, whoever's trying to kill the guy that whipped me yesterday is my friend. Maybe I never saw him before, but he's my friend just by definition. So some take that side, either out of loyalty or in the hope that a surer path toward liberty and racial equality lay with the British crown. Indeed, the ideology of freedom that so characterized the American Revolution proved to be a galvanizing message, I think, Imagine Community. So there's all this rhetoric around about freedom, about Americans making this case that Britain is trying to literally enslave them. Many of the Founding Fathers said exactly that. Britain is trying to enslave us. Imagine how that must have sounded. They're at the dinner table writing this, British are trying to enslave us, as somebody's pouring them some tea, right? Like, enslave? You know what slavery is? They probably want to hit him with the teapot. Think about how that rhetoric says, well, if you're saying slavery is wrong, then what am I? So this whole age is going to raise certain contradictions that have to be dealt with during the war and after the war. They're going to have to be dealt with. American patriots fighting for independence from British rule firmly believed that freedom and self-determination were unalienable or inalienable rights, without which they could not survive. As one famous patriot put it, Patrick Henry's famous words, give me liberty or give me death. They didn't like that sentence, though, when slaves started saying it. Because that way, wait a second, that might lead to a slave revolt, liberty or death, right? African Americans, however, found themselves confronted with the difficult question of what liberty and freedom actually meant for them. So I think if you're fighting on the American side, and okay, if I've helped them and they win, I'm still a slave, right? Or maybe they'll say, okay, since you fought so bravely, you'll let us go. That's a calculation that some make. But that's a dangerous calculation, right? Or vice versa. If I fight for the British and they win, I'll be free. Or what if I fight for the British and they lose? It cost me my life. Right? Or we don't know these British folks. Maybe they're just as bad as the Americans. Right? They say the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. You don't know what to expect. So there are going to be some difficult calculations that have to be made. We're going to see how individuals might answer that question differently as to who they are loyal to. The fact that black patriots chose to fight for American independence, despite the fact that America denied them freedom, became a rallying cry for those who fought for the abolition of slavery in the years that preceded the next great American struggle, the Civil War. So we're going to see some connections between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, what happens about 80 years later. Some people call it the Civil War the unfinished revolution in a way, because a lot of things are going to come out of this period unfinished or partially finished. So again, think in terms of these big questions and how you might begin to answer these questions for yourself based on some of the examples we're going to see, read about, talk about, hear about. So guiding question, evaluate the following statement and your response to it will be the beginning of your thesis statement or argument. From an African American perspective, the American Revolution was conservative and could even be called a contradiction, given its use of the rhetoric or language of liberty and freedom, and its unwillingness, I messed up something there, unwillingness to give them freedom while defending slavery. I kind of messed up that typos there. To explore the nature of freedom and the contradiction of ideas of slavery and freedom in revolutionary America from an African American perspective. In attempting to define whether or not the revolution was actually more conservative than radical, and in what ways, if any, African Americans, this is messed up, this is not the right version, but it's close, demonstrated or contradicted American notions of freedom. Consider the following themes or aspects as they relate to the African American experiences during the period. So there are two basic questions. Is the American Revolution, in your view, conservative or radical? And do African Americans constitute are they a contradiction to it? Do they contradict the whole sort of process? What you're going to do in answering this, and this really lays out everything. There's a set of deadlines here for the next 2 weeks, basically, things you'll be doing. There's some themes that I want you to look at. There's kind of an outline of how the paper will look. It's all kind of here for you. But basically what you're going to be doing is this. You're going to be choosing a main character, and you're going to view this period through their eyes. You're going to choose a main character from the time period, sort of see how they experience the revolution or the years, immediately before or after the revolution, and how they answer these questions. Right? You're going to use them to kind of make your argument about how you answer these questions, whether the revolution is conservative or radical, and whether African Americans are its main contradiction. We're going to see a number of characters here. We're going to read about some. You already have, if you've read chapter 3 already, you may have some possible examples in mind. There are 2 good videos that I have that do some of the same things. They're going to look at this period through several examples or several individuals. And you're going to take these main characters and use them to kind of make a larger argument answering those questions that we just raised. Is the revolution conservative or radical? And how do African Americans serve as its contradiction? Now you have some choices. There isn't one right or wrong main character here. You can choose a man or a woman. You can choose a slave or a free person. You can choose a soldier or someone African American that just lives through this period. Right? And you can actually choose 1 or 2 main characters if you feel like you need 2. That's fine. I don't want you to choose more than 2 because then that takes kind of too much time and space, right? You're supposed to be using these figures to deal with the larger kind of questions, almost kind of like you did with an identification. Right? You're looking at a specific term, but you're making these larger connections. Who, what, when, where. Most important is the why, right? How do you answer these questions? Yes?
You writing a story?
Yes, it's a paper. Yep, 4 to 5 pages. If you look at the second page, you'll see exactly how the outline at the bottom of the second page, exactly how it'll be laid out. Actually, I'll get to that. I'll get to that in a second. The way you go about doing this, how do you move from your main character to these larger questions?
Wait, so you said we choose who we're talking about?
Yeah, you're going to choose which character you want. I don't force you, but I give you a list of people that are possible here. You can choose them or you can choose someone else. So underneath that, in main characters examples, a lot of these come from the textbooks. Some of them come from the videos, including one part of one we're about to watch right now, and other sources. There's everything you need for this project is in the paper, on Blackboard, and in the textbook. In this, if you can see this.
You want to work cited?
Week 8, yes. In the Week 8 folder, there's a folder called Revolutionary, what's it called? Research Paper Folder. Week 8 folder, Research Paper Folder. This handout that you have in your hand is this right here. And then Research Paper Folder, there are a series of folders here. The handout is in here again. Here are a couple of videos. There's some primary sources here. There's some secondary sources here that might be useful, and some other internet sources, websites, and things that may be useful for you to go through. I want you to go through those and see which ones you think are useful for you. I did it this way, so basically you don't have to go outside and make trips to the library and run all around town trying to find it. So you have much more than enough material between your textbooks and the Blackboard site to do this project. If you want to get something from outside, or if you have something at home, feel free to do that, but you don't have to. So in terms of these main characters, one may focus their discussion on one of the figures from the period, including but not limited to Thomas and Jupiter Jefferson. Jupiter is the slave I mentioned that's his same age. He's mentioned in the video here in a second. All right, so think about this. Thomas Jefferson, from a boy, grows up with this guy that was his same age, used to be his playmate. Guy goes off to college with him, same age. Right? And yet one is enslaved and one is free. You can think about kind of the contradictions there when they suddenly reach adulthood. It's like, okay, we're still friends, but we're not really that cool. You're my slave. You know your place, kind of thing, right? So maybe that relationship provides something you want them to look at or talk about. Quack, this guy Titus, or Colonel Ty, you'll see him in the video. Mumbet, you'll see her in the video. Phyllis Wheatley, some of you may know Phyllis Wheatley. She's famous, considered one of the first African-American poets. She's a poet during this period and writes several interesting poems that we'll talk about. Some of them are in the documents, in the textbook documents, in fact. Gabriel Prosser leads the slave revolt in 1800. David Walker is a free black person that writes after the revolution, but he's writing about the revolution. He actually writes David Walker's Appeal, where he talks specifically about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Jefferson and others, and says that they are hypocrites in a very radical kind of tone. So he's a good example of something I wanted to say. Now, this is specifically about the Revolutionary period. You can talk about Revolutionary War soldiers if you want, but you're not limited just to the war. I want you to really think about this whole kind of age of revolution. Right? So the 1770s when the war begins is fine, the 1780s when the war ends and we get the Constitution, 1800 when Gabriel Prosser does his revolt. Still kind of the age of revolution in the new nation. David Walker's writing in the 1820s about the new nation and its contradictions. So I'm really making this kind of broad in terms of what you're allowed to sort of deal with in terms of the age of revolution. You have some choices there. Again, it'll become more clear as you see some characters that may jump out to you, some characters that you may want to use to talk about. But these are just a list of some possibilities. You don't have to necessarily choose any one of these. Resistance strategies. These and other figures would rely on many resistance strategies. I told you I'll never teach you about slavery without teaching you about resistance. People are always resisting their status, as we've seen since capture in the Middle Passage and all that. They're trying to resist, even if they don't necessarily succeed, whatever definition that means. Thousands of African Americans will run away during the Revolutionary War. As soon as the shooting starts, they're like, oh, we're out. They take advantage of that opportunity and kind of, as one historian says, they vote with their feet. You don't have to know what they thought about it, right? Because as soon as they get a chance, they're out. Some of them run to the British lines. Say, hey, give me a gun, I'll go on back. I know where they're at. I know what corner they like to hang out on. Right? And so they offer their services. Some just run away and claim their freedom now. I want you to think about how they choose to resist during this era. Resistance can mean a lot of things. Right? We've seen a lot of different types of resistance. Phyllis Wheatley writes poetry. How could that be resistance? Well, she writes poetry and poetry at the time. Might take your mind off the struggle. It's in and of itself, it was disproving a lot of the theories about African peoples, that they were intellectually inferior. Poetry was considered at that time sort of the highest form of literature. Right? Even most, Europeans said, well, we can't do that. That's sort of way up here. So for this slave to be doing poetry, folks are like, what? For many, that shattered their whole vision of what African Americans were and could be. In fact, when she initially starts writing her poetry, people are like, nah. They look at her owners and say, you guys wrote that stuff for her. We don't believe you. They literally got a group of, I think, 13 men, most prominent men in Boston, got a room like this together and examined her. Said, okay, show us, you go write something. Because they did not believe it was possible for her to do it, because she was of a race that wasn't possible. They think these folks are savages. How is she going to master the highest form of Western literature? So that shows you kind of a form of resistance, some might say.
Who was that?
Phyllis Wheatley, one of the first African-American poets. So again, I want you to think about resistance broadly. Maybe resistance just isn't running away. Maybe it just isn't fighting in the war. There might be a lot of things you could call resistance. I want you to start thinking about how do they resist, right? That's kind of how you're getting from your individual main character to this larger question about how they're defining the revolution, how they're viewing the revolution. Right? So be thinking about this theme of resistance. These and other figures will rely on many resistance strategies, including arson, running away, struggling to maintain family links, creating and developing African-American culture, identity, slave or African petitions to British colonial leaders. Some folks write petitions like, hey, we heard that speech you made to the British saying, you're trying to enslave us and this and that. We like that. Why don't you free us? Why don't you go ahead and continue to extend these rights that you're fighting for to us? All these petitions start flying into colonial leaders. Some of them get sent to the British. They're saying, look, if you're going to make all these arguments, we're going to appeal to those arguments as well. That could counter resistance. Writing essays and other cultural productions, revolutionary service for slaves or Africans on both sides, right, the British side or the American side. One of the skills we'll need to complete this project will be the ability to make connections between specific and general information. So you're thinking about your specific character and their experiences, but you're thinking about this larger question of the revolution and what it means to them. Is it ultimately conservative? How do they resist? How do they provide a contradiction for it? I should be thinking about this connection between specific and general. Utilizing both primary sources and secondary sources. Now, primary sources are sources written during the time period. Right? Sources that you see during the time period. So someone living through the war that writes a diary of their daily experiences, right? If that diary happens to survive and make it down to us, we can read that today and know what they were thinking in 1770. Right? That's a primary source. These petitions and letters that they wrote, many of them have survived. That's a primary source. Now, a secondary source is something written after the fact. Your textbook is a secondary source. Historians write secondary sources, articles, books, these films. Now, secondary sources often use primary sources in making their arguments. You'll notice that your textbook, when you're reading, they often refer to stuff written in the time period. That helps historians kind of understand the experiences of people that are no longer here. What you want to do is combine the two. Use some primary sources, use some secondary sources, and put them together to make your argument. That's all I do when I stand up here, give you my perspective on stuff based on the book, based on primary sources, based on the videos, based on other sources like Imagine Community, Tipping Point. That's essentially what you're doing in this argument, kind of combining primary sources and secondary sources. And there are some examples here. And again, you have both primary and secondary sources in the folder on this Blackboard site. So primary sources, things like proclamations, letters, newspaper ads at the time, art, other cultural productions, statistics, maps. Those could all be considered primary sources. Secondary sources, books, journal articles, films. You'll consider the broad contours of the American Revolution and the birth of the United States of America. This, as we know which way this war goes. We know the Americans win, and it leads to what's now called the United States of America. They were colonies. They become a nation as a result of this war. And we know how it turns out. Subsequent debates over the future direction of the nation, because things don't end just because the war ends. Some folks think that this war is going to end slavery. How can you make all these arguments about all men are created equal and then say, well, psych, you're still a slave? That's exactly what they do. Now, there is a moment there where they debated. A lot of folks were saying, we can't do this. There are a lot of folks that say, you know what, we're hypocrites. If we make all these arguments about all men are created equal and King George of England is trying to enslave us, we have to make everybody equal. It really is the beginning of an anti-slavery movement in this country. Louder voices than ever before are going to come out of this revolution. And a number of Africans do get their freedom in this period. There are a number, especially some soldiers, that kind of bet right. They're like, hey, let's see how this goes. If they survive the war, many of them get their freedom. But slavery is not ended as a result of the American Revolution. In fact, it's going to get even bigger. There are about 700,000, I think, Africans when the war begins. By 1860, right before the Civil War begins, there are 4 million slaves. So it gets bigger than it ever was before. Is that a contradiction? That's up to you to decide. Okay, so hopefully this gives you a good entry point into what we're going to start doing. This is really a 2-week project, but I want you to start thinking of it. I want you to take it step by step and laying this out. That's really the only good way to write something anyway. Writing stuff overnight, even for those of you that are geniuses, it's better to do it step by step. Yes, question.
You said you're having a list of goals and possibly choose that going to be on Blackboard, or you're giving that to
They're here. Yeah, they're under main characters. Thomas and Jupiter Jefferson, Quack, Colonel Ty, Mumbet, Phyllis Wheatley, Gabriel Prosser, David Walker. It's the third paragraph down on the first page. I'm going to give you some others as well. Those are some that come up in the textbook and in some of these visual sources, beginning with what I want you to watch here in a second. So I wanted to put them in here so you know the names ahead of time as you see them. But any main character, and it's up to you to decide which main character you want to talk about. You have freedom in doing that and choosing which character you think helps make the argument you want to make. But these are, definitely some good ones to start with, and I think you'll find many of them interesting based on what you're going to see and read about. And they have different types of resistance too, as you'll see. Many of them choose to resist differently. Yes.
Is Phyllis Wheatley on the textbook?
She's in the textbook. I think they have a couple of her poems as some of the documents in the textbook. I have one of her poems, I believe, in the primary sources. We're going to talk about her a little more, too, because she's really, really interesting and complicated in some ways. Some people say her poetry is too conservative because of some of the themes we'll talk about, whereas some of her other, she writes a letter to George Washington, like, hey, don't forget about us, right? She writes a letter to some British officials, right? So it's really, she's interesting in terms of her resistance. We'll talk more about her as well. Another question over here?
And what about Quack?
Quack? Yeah, you'll see him here in a second. He comes up in one of the videos. Quack is I think it's the first one mentioned, in fact. So I tried to list him here so you'll sort of get some name, face recognition.
Is it used in chapter 3?
Yeah, 3 and 4 are really, in terms of the textbook, 3 and 4 are the ones that are going to be most helpful. 3 deals specifically with the Revolutionary War years itself. 4 is moving, remember, as soon as the revolution's over, they got to figure out what they're going to do in this new nation. So the Constitution, for example, comes out of the revolution. The Constitution was not in place during the revolution itself. It's immediately afterwards that they say, okay, now we got to come up with a government. Now we're a nation, we no longer have Britain doing these things for us. So they develop a constitution. I'm going to talk about that too. I'll kind of give you some, traditional American history, like lecture type information on the revolution and the new nation. But yeah, the chapter 4 is more about the new nation and it's the difficult choices that have to be made. One of the things they do in the Constitution is not outlaw slavery. They choose not to touch the slave trade for 20 years, right? Because they feel like they have to keep it. They say, you know what, this is our economy. Remember, people do things for money, right? They say, look, we're a nation now. Even if we wanted to get rid of slavery, we couldn't possibly do it and pay our bills. So they say, you know what, we won't touch this. We won't even discuss it, debate it for at least 20 years. Now, what's interesting is they say that in 1787, right, as they're framing the Constitution. In 20 years, they do actually abolish the slave trade. So at the first possible time allowed by that earlier discussion, they say, okay, let's get rid of the slave trade. Now, they don't end slavery. Right? The slave trade, in terms of bringing in slaves to this country, ends January 1, 1808. But as we know, that didn't mean they stopped holding people as slaves. They just made it illegal to bring in any more Africans for various reasons. Right? A lot of folks are like, oh, those Africans are too rebellious. Right? We keep bringing them in, it's going to be a revolt. Let's not, right? So it's interesting, and there's some complications and some contradictions coming out of this. I want you to start thinking about it. You shouldn't have all the answers yet. You should have more questions than answers, in fact, right now. Yes?
It's like when I choose my person and I'm reading down the statement and the introduction,
Mm-hmm.
when it says the who, what, when, where, so we're just going to talk about the person we choose and their background and their beliefs?
I'm going to help you as much as I can, but what I try not to do is change people's writing styles. There's a few different ways you can do, say, your introduction. What you're going to need to do is tell me about the time period. Like, are you writing about the war? If you say you're writing about a Revolutionary War soldier, you should probably tell me something about that soldier and about the war in terms of background information, so that when I put that who, what, when, where, that could be any number of things. Right? You're kind of introducing the subject to get to your specific argument. But in part, it depends on who your main character is. It depends on your writing style. Some folks jump right into the argument. Then they're going to set up the background. Some folks want to lay out all the background first. The American Revolution was this and that. This many people died, and it raised certain contradictions, and then get to it. So we'll talk about that. The first thing we're going to start doing is having you start thinking about what main characters you're going to choose, and then start thinking about your specific thesis statement. I'll go over that in a second when I get down to the timeline a little bit here. I've given you some pushes in several directions here too. It says, starting today, 322, begin considering the specific aspects of the Revolutionary era that your research will explore or focus on. For instance, choose 1 or 2 main characters, preferably from a primary source, to use as your central example. You will consider key questions about your characters. How does their race, class, gender, etc. influence their decisions and or experiences? So women living through the war might have experienced it differently than a soldier on the front lines. Right? That just gender may come into this. Right? Any number of factors might come into this. I want you to think in breaking down your main character and their experiences. What other key themes arise? Right? What else comes up in their experience that you can talk about? For example, if discussing gender, how might notions of manhood or womanhood help us understand their motivations? A lot of these soldiers say, you know what, I'm a man. I need to go fight in this war. Men often define themselves by, exposing themselves to violence and whatnot, right? To this day, that's still seen as a part of manhood. Especially at this moment, though, when the soldiers were supposed to all be men, right? We know women are soldiers nowadays, right? But at this point, that was a manly thing. So despite the fact that, well, I shouldn't say despite the fact, if you are a slave, right, somebody's telling you your whole life, you're a slave, you're not a man. Maybe when this war comes, maybe the first thing you do is say, I'm going to prove my manhood by getting me a gun and shooting up some folks, some white folks. Maybe that's what some of them say that's the best way I can prove my manhood. Oh, you don't think I'm a man? How you like me now? Right? So it's interesting that manhood and gender might come into this conversation. If that's just for a soldier, any number of people, though, might define it differently. Now, Phyllis Wheatley doesn't fight in the war. She's writing. That's her fight, her way of fighting, you could say.
I have a question. How would you like for us to cite this? Like what format?
Whatever format is you're comfortable with, as long as it's consistent and as long as it's cited.
Okay.
But we can talk about that too. But yeah, I don't necessarily prefer Chicago or MLA. It's up to you. As long as it's consistent and as long as you're citing your sources.
How many schools do it?
Huh?
How many schools do it?
Yes, it's 4 to 6 sources, I believe. And here, there's some flexibility there. You have plenty to choose from. And they can be different types of sources, from textbooks to primary sources to the videos. I think the videos are going to be very helpful for you in terms of fleshing out some of these things. Lastly, your paper should conclude briefly by briefly drawing out some general conclusions about the short-term or long-term implications of the revolution and the birth of the nation. So your little conclusion paragraph, I want you to think about the future. Right? The war ends, but the problems don't end for African Americans. Right? The contradictions don't end, and in many ways they may have gotten worse. Right? It's interesting that within 80 years of becoming a nation, this nation's going to be in civil war. Once again, largely about the issue of slavery. Civil War is even a bloodier conflict than the Revolutionary War was. So it's interesting that many of these unresolved conflicts lead us directly to another war in terms of this nation. So I want you to just think briefly about what comes afterward. Right? The majority of your stuff comes in the stuff leading up to the conclusion, but even start thinking about how the stuff may relate to what comes later. This revolution laid the foundation for significant events in American, African American, and world history, including the Constitution, a growing anti-slavery abolitionist movement, ultimately sectionalism, kind of North and South, right, fighting each other, coming of the Civil War, and ultimately the end of slavery. Could any of these events have happened if the American Revolution had not happened first? You should conclude your paper by considering such questions. At the same time, the question framing the overall project is whether or not the revolution can be considered conservative or radical to those who participated in it, and particularly to African Americans. Right? Do they serve as a contradiction? Based on your research, decide where you stand on this question. That really is the beginning of your thesis, and how the historical evidence in your main characters' experiences support your viewpoint. I need to read the completing this project. Students will. We've kind of done that. So this next part is an outline. I've sort of given you a blueprint on how to do this. To successfully complete this project using primary and secondary sources, you will develop and write a 4 to 5 page paper that includes the following. Introduction, that sets up the background and historical context. I want you to think who, what, when, where. That's one of the reasons we do the IDs first before doing this. It's because that's what you were doing with the identifications, right? You have a term. You tell me about that term and contextualize it, define it. But the most important part is the why, your thesis, your argument. Same thing with this essay. Your introduction examines the key themes or factors relevant to your discussion of blacks in the Revolutionary era. Maybe that's one paragraph, maybe it's 2. Again, it's up to you stylistically, but generally think about it in this order. Your thesis statement. Clearly lay out your answer to the question of whether or not the revolution was conservative or contradictory, why you believe what you believe, and how you plan to specifically demonstrate it in this paper. So I'm giving you a blueprint specifically for your thesis. 3 parts, basically. Answer the question, why? Why do you believe what you believe? and how do you specifically plan to show it? So you'll talk about the how part, this main character shows this, going through the revolution, blah, blah. I want you to be as specific as possible in your thesis. Once you do that, the rest of the paper will largely write itself because you'll know exactly what you're writing about, you'll know exactly what you're arguing, you'll know exactly who your main character is, and so will your reader. Make sense? We'll talk more about that as we come and have you turn in your thesis statements actually first in a week. Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by contradictory? I just don't get it. How you can put contradiction in this?
Yeah, well, there are really two guiding questions for this. Is the American Revolution, generally speaking, radical or conservative? And secondly, are African Americans its contradiction? Is the fact that they're fighting this war, claiming all men are created equal, claiming that Britain is trying to enslave them, and then African Americans are there like, hey, what about us? Right? That would seem to make the Americans hypocrites. That would seem to provide a contradiction to everything that they're arguing. So I frame it as a question. Do you think that's the case? Maybe you don't think that's the case. Maybe you think, that there is no contradiction there. But I want you to think about those two things. Is it radical or conservative? And we'll talk more about this too, but when I get into some of the years leading up to the revolution next time. But African Americans are really the focus here. What do they see? Would they see it as a contradiction? Now, some of them definitely do, and they choose to fight for the British. Others may say, I'm going to fight for the Americans anyway, right? Despite the fact that it seems hypocritical to be making these arguments yet holding people as slaves. The British make the same case. British are like, what are you talking about? Like, how do you say we're trying to enslave you and you're sending your slaves to shoot us? That don't even make sense. There's just a lot of stuff floating around in the air that people are sorting out. And I want you to think about it first in terms of questions and really begin to answer those questions for yourself. Again, I think helping you to answer those would be seeing these characters and what they experience, what they kind of live through. So I think that'll begin to help you answer these questions. So the introduction, your thesis statement, the body of the paper is going to do a couple of things here. The body is really the main part of the essay. In the body, I want you to do a couple of things. It's going to have a brief review of the relevant sources. I want you to tell me something about the sources that you choose, right? Whether it's the videos, whether it's something from the textbook chapter, whether it's one of these something from primary sources on Blackboard or secondary additional sources. I want you to tell your reader something about your sources. Yes, I read every source that you're going to be reading, but you almost have to assume I don't know what you're reading. I'd like your roommate to be able to pick up your paper and go, oh, okay, what you read this and that? Oh, that's why you think what you think. Right? This should be understandable to someone that's not even in this class. Like, that's how general it has to be in a sense, even though you end up getting real specific in terms of making your specific argument. So everybody has the same starting point. Right? We're starting with the same couple of questions, but your answer, your ending point may be very different. There may be, however many people there are in this room, there may be 10 different arguments.
I'm saying, if it was a person like that, we write about him and then we compare him to us, or we compare the reason why. Is that what we're doing in this whole?
You said compare him to you?
I mean, no, not correct. I'm saying the reason why he did what he did. Is that what we write about his history?
Yeah, exactly. Huey Newton's an interesting one. So you look at the 1960s through Huey Newton's eyes. Why does he do what he did? Right. I mean, he was a community college student taking law classes. Him and David Hilliard, they get their law books and start following the police around and say, hey, you need to arrest people legally. Now, they had these law books and they had shotguns, which were legal in Oakland at the time, right? So they're like, we're not doing nothing wrong. I'm just standing close to you and making sure you don't beat up this person as you arrest them. Now other people in the community see it and go, wow, these guys are a little different. This is a revolution. But yeah, your interpretation of him could be any number of things. You're looking at the period of, say, the 1960s in this case through his eyes. Why does he make the choices he makes? He could have went a different direction. He could have stayed in law school, became a lawyer, and tried to fight for civil rights that way. He didn't do that. He made certain choices. Not that any choice is right or wrong. These are the choices that people made based on their experiences or the information they had available to them. So yeah, it's not just about a right or wrong kind of thing. It's really about trying to view the period through their eyes. I like that example a lot for that reason. But I want you to tell me about the sources. Like, tell me something about why you believe what you believe. I don't necessarily care about your opinion. It's about how you support your opinion. What's your evidence? So keep that in mind. We'll talk more about that. The body section should analyze the major factors in the revolution and the new nation. It should illuminate some of these key themes, either race, class, gender, what have you, whatever comes up in the experiences you're talking about. And again, this could be different for each person. Your conclusion will restate your thesis, summarize your evidence, and it'll kind of draw these larger implications about thinking about what comes later, like I said earlier. You have a bibliography. Tell me something about the sources, a minimum of 4 to 6 primary, secondary sources. And then the last part is the deadlines. It starts today. I want you to start thinking about this today. If you've already read chapter 3, you're in good position because it lays out the revolution. I'm going to talk to you about the revolution itself. We're going to watch part of these videos in class. We don't have time to watch the whole thing of both videos, so that's why I put that on here as part of your deadlines. We're going to watch the first part of Africans in America, part 2 today. That it's about the revolution. It's called Revolutions, and it's about the revolution, and it introduces a number of these characters. There's a second video on here that's also useful that introduces some of the main characters called Liberty in the Air. And again, all the instructions, those videos themselves are on the Blackboard site. I want you to look at the Blackboard site and kind of work your way through these sources to see which ones might be most useful to you by the 26th. I'm going to read chapter 4, which takes us into the new nation, by the 28th. Again, this is reference to the textbook. The 28th will be the deadline for your thesis statement. I'm just expecting a couple of sentences at that point, not the whole paper, not even a rough draft, but I want to see your thesis statement. I'm going to help you refine it a bit. Once you get a strong thesis statement, the paper begins to write itself. So that's why I have you turn that in ahead of time. Yes.
Did you want it printed? This is printed in print or submitted?
Print it and there'll be a
Are we
Dropbox for it.
submitting the email, are we submitting
Thesis?
the paper in Dropbox too?
Yeah, she just asked you to. Yeah, you know how we do it via Dropbox.
A link you would
Yes.
post it in?
Yeah, if you have a problem with that, I can take a hard copy, but I can make comments and everything that way.
How confused guy?
Yeah, knock on wood. Knock on wood. So yeah, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much the overview of it. What we're doing for the next 2 weeks, everything relates to this. But I have to give this to you ahead of time and have you start thinking about it ahead of time, so you can start thinking about it. Because a lot of the subjects that we're talking about will help you begin to refine your argument, including this source I want to show you here in the time we have left. This is Africans in America, Part 2, and it's called Revolutions because it's specifically about the revolution. So pay attention to what you see here as they lay out the experience of African Americans generally during this age of revolution, and as they introduce some of these